The Barrett M82A1 weighed 31 pounds, but in Charlotte Wilson's steady hands, it felt like an extension of her soul. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Bragg training range as she adjusted the bipod legs on the unforgiving. Concrete, her breathing controlled and rhythmic. 200 meters downrange, a watermelon sat perched on a wooden post, not the standard target. But Sergeant Major Rodriguez had insisted on something more visual for the evaluation committee. Watching from the observation tower, preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you liked the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. "Wilson, you have 60 seconds to prove you belong here," came the gravelly voice through her earpiece. The words carried the weight of 3 years of rejection. 3 years of being told that Special Forces wasn't a place for women, regardless of what the new policies said on paper. Charlotte's jaw tightened as she settled into her shooting stance, feeling the familiar kiss of the rifle stock against her shoulder. Behind the reinforced glass of the observation tower, 5 men in pressed uniforms leaned forward with barely concealed skepticism. Colonel Marcus Hayes, the Special Forces Assessment and Selection Commander, tapped his pen against his clipboard with mechanical precision. His steel-gray eyes had seen 1,000 hopefuls come and go, but none quite like the woman currently lying prone on his range. At 26, Charlotte had already broken records at sniper school, earned 2 Bronze Stars in Afghanistan, and maintained a perfect physical fitness score for 4 consecutive years. Yet here she was, taking what Hayes privately called the impossible shot, a test designed not to measure skill, but to break spirit. "Winds picking up from the east," whispered Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, Charlotte's spotter and the only other woman on the range. Elena's dark eyes tracked the subtle movement of grass between them and the target, calculating variables that would determine success or failure. The 2 women had served together in the 82nd Airborne, had crawled through the mud of Kandahar province, and had each other's backs when the brass questioned their every decision. Now, Elena was the only person standing between Charlotte and another rejection that could end her military career. Charlotte's finger hovered over the trigger as memories flashed through her mind like lightning strikes. Her father, Master Sergeant David Wilson, teaching her to shoot in the mountains of North Carolina when she was 12. The day she enlisted, driven by something deeper than patriotism and need to prove that strength came in many forms. The first time a drill instructor told her she'd never make it past basic training because war isn't a place for little girls. The sound of her best friend Maria's voice over the satellite phone, calling from a hospital bed in Germany, paralyzed from the waist down after an IED explosion that Charlotte had been supposed to prevent. The Barrett scope brought the watermelon into crystal clarity, but Charlotte's vision extended far beyond the pink flesh waiting to explode. She saw the faces of every woman who had been told she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, tough enough to serve alongside men in combat. She saw the headlines that would read, "Woman fails Special Forces selection if she missed this shot." Most importantly, she saw the alternative future where she succeeded, where young girls across America would know that barriers existed only until someone had the courage to shatter them. 30 seconds, Wilson. Rodriguez's voice cut through her reverie. The wind had shifted again, now coming from the northwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. Charlotte made microscopic adjustments to her scope, her movements precise and economical. In the observation tower, she could sense the committee members checking their watches, probably placing bets on whether she'd even get the shot off in time. Colonel Hayes leaned closer to the window, his reflection ghosting across the thick glass. He had served in 3 wars, commanded elite units in the most dangerous corners of the world, and prided himself on recognizing potential in soldiers who might otherwise be overlooked. But Special Forces demanded perfection under pressure, and The woman on his range was facing the kind of scrutiny that could make even seasoned operators falter. The Barrett M82A1 wasn't just a rifle, it was a legend. A weapon capable of stopping vehicles and piercing concrete barriers from over a mile away. In the right hands, it could change the outcome of entire battles. In the wrong hands, it was just an expensive paperweight. Charlotte's breathing slowed to an almost meditative rhythm, her heartbeat synchronizing with the subtle vibrations of the earth beneath her. The watermelon seemed to pulse in her scope, a living target that represented every door that had been slammed in her face, every opportunity she'd been denied because of her gender. Her finger applied pressure to the trigger with the gentleness of a lover's touch, building tension that would release in a fraction of a second with devastating effect. Elena's voice came through the earpiece one final time, barely above a whisper. "Wind steady, range is clear, and Charlie ... They're watching you make history." The Barrett's report echoed across the range like thunder, the muzzle blast kicking up dust and debris in a perfect cone behind the rifle. Charlotte absorbed the recoil through her body, maintaining perfect form as the massive bullet crossed the distance to its target in less than a heartbeat. For a moment that stretched like eternity, time seemed suspended in the space between action and consequence. The watermelon didn't just explode, it disintegrated, pink mist and seeds creating of abstract artwork against the clear Carolina sky. The wooden post beneath it remained perfectly intact, a testament to precision that bordered on surgical. In the observation tower, 5 pairs of eyes widened in genuine surprise, and Colonel Hayes found himself reaching for his phone to call the range officer for a verification of the distance. But Charlotte wasn't finished. Without speaking, she cycled the bolt and settled back into position, her movements fluid and confident. 2 more watermelons had been placed at 300 and 400 meters respectively, distances that would challenge even the most experienced snipers with the Barrett's powerful optics. The committee hadn't asked for additional shots, but Charlotte was making a statement that transcended their expectations. "What's she doing?" muttered Captain Thompson, the youngest member of the evaluation committee. His own sniper qualification badge felt suddenly inadequate as he watched the woman on the range chamber another round with mechanical precision. Elena grinned as she adjusted her spotting scope, already calculating the variables for the longer shots. "She's showing you gentlemen what happens when you underestimate a Wilson." The second shot came 30 seconds later, another perfect hit that left the evaluation committee scrambling to recalibrate their understanding of what they were witnessing. Charlotte's form never wavered, her breathing never became labored, and her confidence seemed to grow with each trigger pull. By the time the third watermelon exploded in a satisfying spray of pink destruction, even the most skeptical observers were forced to acknowledge that they were watching something extraordinary. As Charlotte finally lifted her head from the scope, her green eyes met the gaze of Colonel Hayes through the observation window. There was no triumph in her expression, no celebration or relief, only the quiet confidence of someone who had always known this moment would come. She had fired 3 shots in under 2 minutes, achieving perfect accuracy at ranges that would challenge marksmen with decades of experience. But more importantly, she had done so while carrying the weight of every woman who had ever been told she wasn't good enough to serve her country in the way she chose. Elena clapped her on the shoulder, her grin widening as the implications of what they had just witnessed began to sink in. "How do you feel, Charlie?" Charlotte allowed herself a small smile as she began to break down the Barrett, her movements efficient and practiced. "Like I'm just getting started, Elena. Like I'm just getting started." The radio in the observation tower crackled to life, Colonel Hayes' voice cutting through the stunned silence that had settled over the committee. "Range is clear. All personnel stand down. Wilson, report to my office in 15 minutes. As Charlotte secured her weapon and gathered her gear, she could feel the eyes of dozens of soldiers who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Some faces showed admiration, others skepticism, and a few displayed the kind of resentment that she had learned to ignore over the years. But for the first time in her military career, Charlotte felt like she was walking toward her future instead of fighting against her past. The Fort Bragg training facility stretched out around them like a monument to military precision. Its manicured lawns and imposing buildings representing decades of tradition and excellence. Somewhere in those buildings, decisions were being made about her future, about whether the demonstration she had just given would be enough to overcome years of institutional resistance. But as Charlotte walked toward the armory to secure her weapon, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had already won the battle that mattered most, the one against her own doubts. Charlotte's alarm clock screamed at 0430 hours, but she had been awake for 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment off base and running through mental calculations of wind speed, bullet drop, and the precise amount of pressure needed to break Barrett's crisp trigger. She lived in a world measured in inches and milliseconds, where the difference between success and failure could be calculated in the tremor of a heartbeat or the shift of a cloud across the sun. Her morning routine was as precise as her marksmanship. 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, a 5-mile run through the pine forest surrounding Fayetteville, North Carolina, and then breakfast consisting of exactly 2 eggs over easy, 1 piece of wheat toast, and black coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She had learned early in her career that consistency was the foundation of excellence, and excellence was the only currency that mattered in a world determined to find her lacking. The phone rang as she was lacing her boots, Elena's voice cutting through the morning quiet with characteristic directness. "Charlie, you see the news yet?" "What news?" Charlotte balanced the phone against her shoulder as she double-knotted her laces, a habit ingrained from years of training where a loose boot could mean the difference between life and death. Army Times just published an article about yesterday's demonstration, front page of their website. The headline reads, "Female Soldier Seeks to Break Special Forces Barrier." And let me tell you, the comment section is exactly what you'd expect. Charlotte closed her eyes and leaned against her kitchen counter, feeling the familiar weight of public scrutiny settling over her shoulders like a lead blanket. She had hoped that her performance on the range would speak for itself, that the precision of her shots and the professionalism of her conduct would be the only story worth telling. But she lived in a world where every achievement by a woman in the military was dissected, analyzed and questioned in ways that her male counterparts never experienced. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Elena's pause told her everything she needed to know. Some of it supportive, but, "Charlie, these people don't even know you, and they're making judgments about your character, your motivations, your right to serve." One guy wrote a 3-paragraph rant about how women in combat units destroy unit cohesion and get people killed. Another one claims you only got this far because of political correctness and lowered standards. Charlotte poured herself another cup of coffee, the bitter liquid providing a moment of grounding as she processed the information. She had known this day would come, had prepared herself for the backlash that inevitably followed any woman who dared to challenge military traditions. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were 2 entirely different things. "Elena, I've been getting those comments since I enlisted. They said I'd never make it through basic training. Then they said I'd never make it through 8. Then they said I'd never survive a deployment. I've been proving them wrong for 8 years. And I'm not about to stop now." But as she hung up the phone and grabbed her gear bag for another day of training, Charlotte felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with carrying other people's expectations. She thought about her father, who had died of cancer 3 years earlier, never living to see her attempt to join Special Forces. Master Sergeant David Wilson had been a Green Beret himself, one of the old-school operators who believed in earning respect through actions rather than words. He had taught her that the military was a meritocracy, that performance trumped politics, and that excellence would eventually overcome prejudice. The drive to Fort Bragg took 35 minutes through the North Carolina countryside, past farmland and small towns that seemed frozen in time. Charlotte used the commute to center herself, to remember why she had chosen this path despite the obstacles. She thought about Maria Gutierrez, her battle buddy from Afghanistan, who had been paralyzed when their convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. Maria had been the unit's communications specialist, responsible for calling in air support when their patrol came under fire. Charlotte had been the designated marksman, positioned on overwatch to provide covering fire. When the explosion sent shrapnel through Maria's spine, Charlotte had carried her friend 300 meters under enemy fire to the extraction point. Maria survived, but she would never walk again, and Charlotte had never forgiven herself for not spotting the IED before it detonated. The guilt had driven her to excel at every task, to push herself beyond normal human limits, as if perfect performance could somehow balance the scales of that one catastrophic failure. When the Army opened Special Forces to women, Charlotte saw it as an opportunity to honor Maria's sacrifice by becoming the kind of soldier who could prevent others from experiencing similar tragedies. The base was already buzzing with activity. When she arrived, soldiers conducting PT in organized formations, while drill sergeants shouted encouragement and corrections. Charlotte parked her Honda Civic between two massive pickup trucks, noting the contrast between her practical vehicle and the testosterone-fueled machinery that dominated military parking lots. She had learned to navigate these subtle symbols of belonging, understanding that everything from her choice of vehicle to her preferred workout music was subject to judgment and interpretation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting for her at the arms room, already checking equipment for another day of advanced marksmanship training. Elena had been Charlotte's closest friend in the military, a fellow sniper who understood the unique pressures of excelling in a male-dominated field. Where Charlotte was quiet and introspective, Elena was outgoing and confrontational, willing to challenge anyone who questioned their competence or dedication. "Morning, sunshine," Elena said with a grin that didn't quite hide the concern in her dark eyes. "Ready for another day of proving yourself to people who've already made up their minds?" Charlotte shouldered her gear bag and signed for her assigned weapon, a standard M4 carbine that felt light and familiar after yesterday's work with the Barrett. "I'm ready for another day of training, Elena. That's all I've ever been ready for." They walked together toward the training area, past clusters of soldiers who turned to watch them pass. Some nods were respectful, acknowledging Charlotte's demonstrated skill and professionalism. Others carried the weight of skepticism, the unspoken assumption that her presence was more about politics than capability. Charlotte had learned to read these micro-expressions, to understand the complex social dynamics that surrounded every interaction in her military life. The morning's training focused on close-quarters combat marksmanship, scenarios designed to test accuracy and decision-making under stress. Charlotte moved through the course with fluid precision, engaging targets with controlled pairs and headshots that consistently landed within the kill zone. Her movements were economical and purposeful, the result of thousands of hours of practice, and an almost supernatural awareness of her body's position in space. Between shooting drills, she found herself thinking about her childhood in the mountains of western North Carolina. Her father had taken her hunting from the time she was 8 years old, teaching her to read animal tracks, to move silently through dense underbrush, and to make ethical shots that ensured clean kills. Those early lessons had shaped her understanding of marksmanship as both science and art, a discipline that required technical precision balanced with intuitive understanding. "Your father would be proud," Elena said during a brief break between exercises, recognizing the distant look in Charlotte's eyes that always appeared when she was remembering David Wilson. "He always said that the rifle was just a tool," Charlotte replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "He said the real weapon was the mind behind it, the will to do what needed to be done when everything else failed." The afternoon brought physical training that pushed even Charlotte's exceptional fitness to its limits. She had always been stronger than her appearance suggested. Her compact frame hiding muscle groups developed through years of carrying heavy equipment across difficult terrain. But Special Forces training demanded more than strength. It required the kind of mental toughness that allowed operators to function effectively after days without sleep, to maintain focus when exhaustion and stress clouded judgment. As she completed her final set of pull-ups, Charlotte noticed Colonel Hayes watching from across the training area. The Special Forces commander's presence was both encouraging and intimidating, a reminder that her performance was being evaluated at the highest levels. She had researched Hayes extensively, studying his service record and reading every interview he had given about the integration of women into combat roles. His reputation was that of a fair but demanding leader who valued competence above all other considerations. After training, Charlotte returned to her apartment and opened her laptop to research enemy tactics and equipment specifications, part of her nightly routine of professional development. She read intelligence reports from current operations, studied case studies of successful Special Forces missions, and maintained detailed notes on everything from foreign weapon systems to cultural practices and potential areas of operation. But tonight, she also found herself scrolling through the comments on the Army Times article that Elena had mentioned that morning. The vitriol was worse than she had expected, with anonymous commenters questioning everything from her physical capabilities to her sexual orientation to her right to wear the uniform. One particularly offensive post suggested that she was only seeking Special Forces qualification to advance her feminist agenda, rather than to serve her country. Charlotte closed the laptop and walked to her bedroom, where a framed photograph of her father sat on the nightstand. Master Sergeant David Wilson smiled back at her from beneath his green beret, his eyes carrying the same determination that she saw in her own reflection. Next to his picture was another frame containing a letter that Maria had written from her hospital bed in Germany, thanking Charlotte for saving her life and encouraging her to pursue her dreams regardless of the obstacles. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, Dad," she whispered to the photograph, feeling the weight of expectations from supporters and detractors alike. "Everyone's watching, everyone has an opinion, and I'm just trying to be the best soldier I can be." The response came not in words but in memory, her father's voice during their last conversation before his death. Weak from chemotherapy, but still carrying the authority that had made him a respected leader. "Charlie, strength isn't about never feeling afraid or uncertain. It's about doing the right thing even when you're scared, even when everyone else tells you it's impossible." As Charlotte prepared for bed, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, acknowledging the loneliness that came with pioneering a path that no woman had traveled before. She thought about the female soldiers who would follow in her footsteps, the daughters and granddaughters who might never face the barriers she was fighting to break down. Their faces gave her strength, reminded her that this journey was about more than personal achievement. Tomorrow would bring another day of training, another opportunity to prove herself worthy of the trust her country might place in her. Charlotte set her alarm for 0430 hours and closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the North Carolina night wash over her as she prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. The first sign of real resistance came during Charlotte's third week of pre-assessment training, when she arrived at the classroom to find her chair deliberately moved to the back corner, isolated from the other candidates. The message was subtle but clear. She was being treated as an outsider, someone whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. 23 men turned to watch her walk to the makeshift exile, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Captain Marcus Webb, the newly assigned training officer, didn't acknowledge the seating arrangement as he began his briefing on unconventional warfare tactics. Webb had arrived from the 3rd Special Forces Group, with a reputation for uncompromising standards and what some called an old-school approach to military culture. His steel blue eyes swept across the room with predatory intensity, lingering on Charlotte just long enough to make his perspective clear without saying a word. "Gentlemen," Webb began, the exclusion of Charlotte from his greeting so deliberate that several candidates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Special Forces operations require split-second decisions under extreme stress. There's no room for hesitation, no time for political correctness, and absolutely no tolerance for weakness that could get your teammates killed." Elena, who was attending the briefing as Charlotte's primary supporter, caught her friend's eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. They had discussed this possibility, that Charlotte's path would involve more than just proving her individual capabilities. She would have to overcome systematic resistance from people who viewed her presence as a threat to military tradition and unit effectiveness. The first exercise involved a scenario where candidates had to infiltrate a mock enemy, compound and extract a high-value target without being detected. Charlotte paired with Sergeant Jake Morrison, a veteran of multiple deployments, who had initially been skeptical of her presence, but had gradually come to respect her skills. Together, they developed a plan that utilized Charlotte's superior marksmanship to provide overwatch while Morrison handled the close-quarters extraction. "Wilson, you take the high ground and keep us covered," Morrison whispered as they studied the training facility's layout. "Your shooting yesterday has me convinced you could thread a needle at 500 meters. Their mission proceeded flawlessly until the final phase, when Captain Webb appeared with a radio and announced a last-minute intelligence update that completely changed the parameters of the exercise. Instead of a single target, there were now 3 hostages held in different locations, and the extraction had to be completed in half the original time frame. This is exactly the kind of adaptability that separates Special Forces from conventional units, Webb announced, his voice carrying through the tactical headsets worn by all participants. "Real operations don't follow training manuals, and successful operators learn to overcome obstacles that weren't part of the original plan." Charlotte recognized the setup immediately, an attempt to create a failure scenario that could be attributed to her presence on the team. She watched as Morrison's face tightened with understanding, realizing that they were being tested not just on their tactical skills, but on their ability to function under artificially imposed stress. "Change of plans," Charlotte said into her microphone, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. "Jake, take hostage 1 and 2. I'll reposition and handle the 3rd target while maintaining overwatch on your extraction route." What followed was 15 minutes of tactical precision that left even the most skeptical observers impressed. Charlotte moved through the training facility like a ghost, using her superior understanding of angles and sightlines to maintain visual contact with Morrison while independently securing her assigned target. Her movements were silent and economical, the result of years spent hunting in the dense forests of her childhood. When the exercise concluded, all 3 hostages had been successfully extracted, and no member of the team had been killed by the opposition force. Captain Webb's expression suggested that this outcome had not been part of his expectations, and his debrief focused more on criticizing minor procedural violations than acknowledging the mission's success. "Morrison, your entry technique was sloppy on target 2, Webb announced to the assembled candidates. "In a real operation, that kind of noise could compromise the entire team. And Wilson, your decision to abandon the overwatch position showed poor tactical judgment that could have resulted in friendly casualties." Elena stepped forward from her position as observer, her usually diplomatic demeanor replaced by barely controlled anger. "Sir, with respect." Sergeant Wilson maintained visual contact with both extraction routes while independently securing her objective. Her repositioning was tactically sound and demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptability you said was essential to Special Forces operations. Webb's jaw tightened as he turned his attention to Elena, clearly not accustomed to having his assessments questioned. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, your role here is to observe and support, not to provide unsolicited tactical analysis." I suggest you remember the boundaries of your assignment." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Charlotte could see the other candidates processing the interaction with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. She had become the focal point of a conflict that extended far beyond her individual performance, a symbol of changes that many viewed as unwelcome intrusions on military tradition. After the debrief, Charlotte found herself approached by Staff Sergeant Danny Cross, a senior candidate who had been notably cold toward her since her arrival at Fort Bragg. Cross was a decorated veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, with the kind of reputation that carried weight throughout the Special Forces community. His opinion could influence how she was perceived by other candidates and, more importantly, by the instructors who would determine her fate. "Wilson, I need to talk to you," Cross said, his tone carrying an edge that made several nearby candidates turn to watch. "This whole situation is getting out of hand, and it's affecting team morale." Charlotte met his gaze directly, recognizing the confrontation that she had been anticipating since her first day of training. "What situation are you referring to, Sergeant Cross?" "You know damn well what I'm talking about. The special treatment, the media attention, the way everything revolves around proving some political point instead of focusing on military effectiveness. Half these guys are walking on eggshells because they're afraid that anything they say or do will be twisted into some kind of discrimination complaint." The accusation hit Charlotte like a physical blow, not because of its cruelty, but because of the grain of truth it contained. She had noticed the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the way her teammates seemed to choose their words carefully around her. The spotlight that followed her every move was affecting not just her own experience, but the training environment for everyone else. "Danny, I never asked for special treatment," Charlotte replied, keeping her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. "I'm here because I want to serve my country at the highest level, same as you. If my presence makes people uncomfortable, that's something they need to work through, not something I need to fix by going away." Cross stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "You think this is about your right to be here? This is about life and death, about knowing that the person next to you will do whatever it takes to bring everyone home alive. When the bullets start flying, I need to know that my teammates are thinking about the mission, not about how their actions might be perceived by some congressional committee or newspaper reporter." Before Charlotte could respond, Morrison appeared at her shoulder, his presence shifting the dynamic of the confrontation. "Danny, that's enough. Charlotte's proven herself every day she's been here. If you've got a problem with the way training is being conducted, take it up with the chain of command, not with her." Cross looked between Charlotte and Morrison, his expression suggesting that he viewed their developing friendship as another example of the complications created by her presence. "Jake, you're a good soldier, but you're letting politics cloud your judgment. When this whole experiment fails, it's going to be guys like us who pay the price." The confrontation ended without resolution, but its effects rippled through the training environment like shockwaves. Charlotte noticed increased tension during group exercises, with some candidates going out of their way to avoid partnering with her, while others seemed to provide extra support as if to compensate for their colleagues' hostility. The artificial division was exactly what she had hoped to avoid, but seemed inevitable given the broader cultural conflict surrounding women combat roles. 3 days later, the tension escalated when Charlotte discovered that someone had sabotaged her gear before a crucial navigation exercise. Her compass had been deliberately miscalibrated, a subtle alteration that would have sent her miles off course during a nighttime land navigation course that served as a major component of the assessment process. Only Elena's last-minute equipment check prevented what could have been a career-ending failure. "This is criminal, Charlie," Elena said as they examined the tampered equipment in the privacy of the equipment room. "Someone deliberately tried to sabotage your training, And we both know this isn't some random act of vandalism. Charlotte turned the compass over in her hands, feeling the weight of malicious intent behind the seemingly minor alteration. In the field, navigation errors killed soldiers and compromised missions. Someone had been willing to risk her safety, and potentially the safety of other soldiers, to manufacture a failure that could be used to justify her removal from training. "We report this to Colonel Hayes immediately," Elena continued, her voice tight with anger. "This crosses every line, and whoever did it needs to face consequences." But Charlotte found herself hesitating, recognizing that filing a formal complaint would only reinforce the perception that she needed protection from the rigors of Special Forces training. She thought about Cross's words about teammates needing to trust each other completely, about the corrosive effects of doubt and suspicion on unit cohesion. "Elena, if we make this official, it becomes another story about how the Army had to protect the female candidate from harassment. It feeds into every stereotype about women needing special accommodations to succeed in military roles." Elena stared at her friend with a mixture of admiration and frustration. "Charlie, someone tried to sabotage your career, possibly put you in physical danger. You can't just ignore that because you're worried about public perception." The internal conflict Charlotte felt was reflected in her expression as she weighed her options. She could report the incident and potentially identify the saboteur, but doing so would reinforce narratives about her vulnerability and need for protection. Alternatively, she could handle the situation privately, demonstrating the kind of resilience expected of Special Forces candidates, while avoiding the appearance of seeking special treatment. "I'm not going to ignore it," Charlotte said finally, her voice carrying a determination that Elena recognized from their most challenging moments in Afghanistan. "But I'm going to handle it my way, on my terms." What Charlotte decided was both tactically brilliant and personally risky. Instead of filing a formal complaint, she began arriving at the training facility an hour early each morning to personally inspect all of her equipment. She established her own security protocols, treating her gear with the same level of protection that would be required in a hostile environment. Most importantly, she began documenting everything, photographing her equipment before and after training exercises, maintaining detailed logs of interactions with other candidates and instructors, and building a comprehensive record that could be used if the situation escalated further. The strategy worked on multiple levels. Her obvious competence at protecting her own equipment demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking valued in Special Forces operations. Her refusal to seek administrative protection reinforced her reputation for self-reliance and mental toughness. And her meticulous documentation created an evidentiary foundation that would support future action if the harassment continued or escalated. But the psychological toll was significant. Charlotte found herself constantly on guard, unable to trust even the most seemingly innocent interactions. Every equipment malfunction became suspect. Every training challenge carried the possibility of artificial interference, and every conversation with fellow candidates was analyzed for hidden meanings or hostile intent. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect to endure. Charlotte had always been a collaborative soldier, someone who built strong relationships with teammates and contributed to unit morale through her combination of competence and good humor. Now she found herself maintaining professional distance from everyone except Elena, unable to fully trust anyone else in the training environment. Despite these challenges, her performance continued to excel. During a complex combat scenario that required coordinated movement across difficult terrain while engaging multiple enemy positions, Charlotte's tactical suggestions helped her team complete the mission with 0 casualties and maximum efficiency. Her ability to remain focused on operational objectives while managing personal stress impressed even the most skeptical observers. Captain Webb, however, seemed determined to find fault with her performance, regardless of objective measures of success. His written evaluations consistently focused on minor procedural issues rather than tactical effectiveness, and his verbal feedback emphasized areas for improvement rather than acknowledging strengths that were obvious to everyone else. Present. Wilson's performance continues to meet minimum standards. Webb wrote in one assessment that Elena managed to glimpse during an administrative review. However, her presence continues to create training distractions that may impact overall unit effectiveness during actual operations. The bias was so obvious that even some of Charlotte's initial critics began to recognize the unfairness of her treatment. Morrison approached her after a particularly successful hostage rescue exercise, where her precision shooting had saved 2 team members from simulated enemy fire. "Charlotte, I owe you an apology," Morrison said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "When you first arrived, I thought this was some kind of publicity stunt, a way for the Army to prove how progressive it was without caring about operational effectiveness. But I've watched you perform under pressure, seen how you handle stress and adversity, and you're exactly the kind of soldier I'd want covering my back in a real fight." The support from Morrison and a growing number of other candidates provided emotional sustenance during the most challenging phase of Charlotte's training. But she knew that individual acceptance was not enough. She needed to demonstrate her value to the institutional leadership that would ultimately determine whether women could serve in special forces roles. That opportunity came during a capstone exercise designed to test every skill the candidates had developed during their pre-assessment training. The scenario involved a simulated downed pilot recovery mission in hostile territory, requiring teams to infiltrate enemy-controlled areas, locate and extract the pilot, and return to friendly lines without being detected or captured. Charlotte was assigned to a team led by Sergeant Cross, the same soldier who had confronted her about the effects of her presence on unit morale. The pairing was clearly intentional, designed to test whether personal conflicts could be set aside when mission success was at stake. Cross made his feelings clear during the initial mission briefing, his tone professional but cold. "Wilson, you'll be our designated marksman, providing overwatch while the rest of us handle movement and extraction. Stay in position, follow orders, and don't do anything that jeopardizes the mission for the sake of proving a point." The mission began before dawn, with teams moving through dense North Carolina forests toward their assigned objectives. Charlotte's team advanced with practiced precision, using hand signals and tactical movement techniques that had been drilled into them through weeks of intensive training. As they approached the target area, Charlotte separated from the main group to establish an overwatch position on high ground that provided clear sight lines across multiple approach routes. For 3 hours, she maintained perfect surveillance, while Cross's team conducted their search pattern. Through her scope, she tracked the movements of opposition forces, cataloging their positions and patterns while maintaining radio silence to avoid compromising her teammates. The level of concentration required was exhausting, but Charlotte had trained for exactly this kind of sustained focus. The pilot was located in a small clearing approximately 800 meters from Charlotte's position, guarded by a 2-person enemy team armed with automatic weapons. Cross's team developed a plan to neutralize the guards and extract the pilot, but the approach required crossing open ground that would leave them exposed to enemy observation posts. "Overwatch, this is team leader," Cross's voice crackled through Charlotte's earpiece. "We need those observation posts neutralized before we can move on the target. Can you provide precision fire support without compromising your position?" Charlotte studied the tactical problem through her scope, identifying 3 enemy positions that could interfere with the extraction. The shots would need to be taken in rapid succession from a single position, requiring her to remain stationary, while potentially exposing her location to return fire. It was exactly the kind of high-risk, high-reward scenario that Special Forces operators faced in real combat situations. "Team leader, I can engage all 3 targets from current position. but I'll need 60 seconds to reposition after firing. To avoid counter-battery fire, you'll have a 90-second window to complete extraction before I can resume Overwatch." Cross paused, and Charlotte could imagine him weighing the tactical risks against the mission requirements. In a real operation, the decision would mean trusting his life and the lives of his teammates to Charlotte's marksmanship skills and tactical judgment. "Overwatch, you are cleared to engage. Execute on my mark." Charlotte's breathing slowed too. A meditative rhythm as she acquired her first target, an enemy observer positioned behind a fallen log approximately 600 meters downrange. The morning mist created slight visibility challenges, but her scope cut through the haze with crystalline clarity. She made microscopic adjustments for wind and elevation, her finger applying gradual pressure to the trigger. Execute, execute, execute. The first shot echoed across the training area like thunder. The simulated enemy observer marked as eliminated by exercise controllers before he could react. Charlotte immediately shifted to her second target, a guard positioned on elevated ground who was already turning toward the sound of gunfire. Her second shot followed within 5 seconds, another perfect hit that neutralized the threat before it could respond effectively. The third target proved more challenging, as the remaining enemy fighter had gone to ground after hearing the first 2 shots. Charlotte tracked his movement through thick underbrush, waiting for the moment when he would expose himself enough for a clean shot. When he finally raised his head to scan for the source of the incoming fire, Charlotte's bullet found its mark with surgical precision. "All targets neutralized," she reported through her microphone, already beginning to disassemble her shooting. "Position, repositioning to alternate Overwatch location." Cross's team moved with impressive speed, covering the open ground and reaching the downed pilot in less than 60 seconds. Charlotte watched through her scope as they secured the area, administered first aid to the simulated casualty, and prepared for extraction. Her new position provided excellent coverage of their withdrawal route, allowing her to track potential threats while remaining concealed from enemy counterattack. "Outstanding shooting, Overwatch," Morrison's voice came through the team radio, carrying genuine admiration. "Those were some of the cleanest shots I've ever seen under tactical conditions." But the exercise wasn't over. As Cross's team began their withdrawal with the rescued pilot, additional enemy forces appeared along their planned escape route. Charlotte counted at least 6 opposition fighters moving to intercept her teammates, armed with automatic weapons, and positioned to create a devastating crossfire that would eliminate the entire team. "Team leader, you have multiple contacts converging on your position," Charlotte reported, her voice calm despite the tactical crisis developing below her. 6 enemies moving to establish blocking positions on your primary extraction route. Recommend immediate diversion to secondary route through grid square 247. Cross's response was immediate and professional, his earlier personal conflicts with Charlotte set aside in favor of mission accomplishment. "Overwatch, can you provide suppressive fire to cover our movement to alternate route?" Charlotte was already repositioning her rifle, calculating angles and distances for what would be the most challenging shooting sequence of her military career. The enemy positions were scattered across difficult terrain, requiring her to engage targets at varying ranges while accounting for different environmental conditions affecting each shot. More importantly, she would need to time her fire precisely to support her teammates' movement without accidentally engaging friendly forces. "Team leader, I can provide covering fire, but you need to move fast and follow my tracer rounds to avoid friendly fire. I'll engage targets from north to south, stay low, and move on my signal." What followed was 3 minutes of tactical brilliance. That impressed even the exercise controllers watching from concealed positions. Charlotte engaged enemy targets with methodical precision, her shots perfectly timed to suppress threats while allowing her teammates to advance. She communicated continuously with Cross's team, providing real-time intelligence about enemy movements and adjusting her fire to create safe corridors for friendly advancement. When the exercise concluded with successful extraction of the simulated pilot and all team members accounted for, even Captain Webb seemed momentarily at a loss for criticism. Charlotte's shooting had been flawless, her tactical communication had been professional and effective, and her ability to coordinate fire support with ground movement demonstrated exactly the kind of advanced skills expected of Special Forces operators. "That was some impressive shooting, Wilson," Cross said as they consolidated at the extraction point, his tone carrying none of the hostility that had characterized their previous interactions. "I've worked with designated marksmen for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone manage that many targets that effectively under tactical conditions." The acknowledgement from Cross represented a breakthrough that extended far beyond individual recognition. Other team members nodded their agreement, and Charlotte could sense a subtle shift in the way she was perceived by the broader candidate group. She had proven her tactical value under realistic combat conditions, demonstrating that her presence enhanced rather than compromised team effectiveness, but the victory was temporary. During the post-exercise debrief, Captain Webb focused his critique on what he characterized as unnecessary risks taken by Charlotte's aggressive fire support. Wilson's shooting was technically proficient, Webb announced to the assembled candidates, but her decision to engage multiple targets from a single position violated standard sniper doctrine and could have compromised her ability to provide sustained overwatch. In a real operation, that kind of tactical inflexibility might get people killed. Elena, who had been observing the exercise from the Tactical Operations Center, could barely contain her frustration as Webb continued his criticism. Furthermore, the team's reliance on long-range fire support demonstrated a concerning dependence on specialized assets that might not be available during actual operations. Special Forces teams need to be self-sufficient, capable of mission accomplishment without external support. Charlotte listened to the critique with growing understanding of the institutional resistance she was facing. No matter how well she performed, no matter how effectively she contributed to mission success, there would always be alternative interpretations that reinforced predetermined conclusions about her suitability for Special Forces service. After the debrief, she found herself walking alone through the pine forest surrounding Fort Bragg, processing the emotional complexity of her situation. Morrison caught up with her near the base perimeter, his expression serious but supportive. "Charlotte, I need you to know that what happened today was remarkable. I've been through 4 deployments, worked with some of the best soldiers in the Army, and I've never seen anyone perform under pressure the way you did. Don't let Webb's politics make you doubt what you accomplished." Charlotte appreciated Morrison's support, but she also recognized the broader implications of her situation. "Jake, I'm not worried about my own performance. I'm worried about what this means for other women who might want to serve in Special Forces roles. If I can't succeed despite doing everything right, what does that tell the next generation of female soldiers?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of her words. "It tells them that change is hard, that institutions don't transform overnight, and that pioneers face challenges that others don't have to overcome. But it also tells them that excellence speaks for itself, and that people of good faith will eventually recognize the truth." As they walked back toward the main base, Charlotte reflected on the complex dynamics that surrounded her every action. She was simultaneously an individual soldier, pursuing personal goals, and a symbol representing larger social changes that made many people uncomfortable. The dual burden was exhausting, requiring her to perform at exceptional levels while managing political and cultural conflicts that had nothing to do with military effectiveness. That evening, she received a phone call from her mother, who had been following her daughter's progress through a combination of official updates and media coverage. Sarah Wilson's voice carried the same strength that had sustained the family through David's illness and death, but Charlotte could hear the underlying concern. "Sweetheart, I saw the news story about the training exercise. It sounds like you're doing remarkable things, but I worry about the pressure you're under." Charlotte curled up on her apartment couch, grateful for the connection to home and family that grounded her during the most challenging phases of her military career. "Mom, it's exactly what Dad prepared me for. The shooting, the tactical thinking, the ability to perform under stress, all of that came from those hunting trips and the lessons he taught me about mental toughness. I know he'd be proud of you, Charlie, but I also know he'd want you to take care of yourself, to remember that you're fighting for something bigger than just proving a point." The conversation with her mother reminded Charlotte of the broader purpose behind her struggles. She wasn't enduring institutional resistance and personal attacks for the sake of her own career advancement. She was breaking barriers that would create opportunities for future generations of women who wanted to serve their country at the highest levels of military excellence. But the human cost of that mission was becoming increasingly apparent. Charlotte found herself isolated from casual social interactions, unable to trust the motivations of people who approached her with friendship or support. Every conversation carried the potential for misinterpretation. Every relationship was complicated by the political implications of her presence at Fort Bragg. The loneliness was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her situation to endure. Charlotte had always been a social person, someone who built strong relationships with teammates and contributed to unit morale through her combination of competence and humor. Now she found herself maintaining careful emotional distance from everyone except Elena, unable to fully trust anyone else in the training environment. Despite these personal costs, Charlotte's commitment to her mission never wavered. She continued to train with obsessive intensity, studying tactics and techniques that might provide advantages during the formal assessment process. She maintained her physical fitness at peak levels, knowing that any sign of weakness would be magnified by critics looking for evidence to support predetermined conclusions about women's limitations. Most importantly, she continued to perform at exceptional levels during every training exercise, building an undeniable record of tactical competence that would be difficult for even the most biased observers to dismiss. Each successful mission, each precise shot, each demonstration of leadership under pressure added another layer to the foundation of evidence supporting her qualification for Special Forces service. As Charlotte prepared for the next phase of her training, she carried with her the knowledge that she was fighting not just for her own dreams but for the future of women in military service. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but so was her determination to succeed despite every obstacle placed in her path. The call came at 2,347 hours on a Tuesday night, jarring Charlotte from the deep sleep that had become increasingly elusive during the final weeks of her pre-assessment training. Colonel Hayes's voice was crisp and professional, betraying nothing of the decision that had been reached after hours of heated discussion in his office. "Wilson, report to my office at 0600 hours. Come prepared for deployment." Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed the implications. Deployment could mean success assignment to a Special Forces unit for operational evaluation, or it could mean transfer to a different assignment as a face-saving alternative to outright failure. She had learned not to read too much into administrative communications, but the timing felt significant. Elena was already waiting in the parking lot when Charlotte arrived at Fort Bragg, her friend's presence providing the emotional support that had sustained her through months of institutional resistance and personal attacks. They walked together through the pre-dawn darkness, both women understanding that this meeting would determine not just Charlotte's immediate future, but the trajectory of women's integration into Special Forces. "Whatever happens in there, you've already made history," Elena said as they approached the headquarters building. "You've proven that women can excel at every aspect of Special Forces training, and that's something no one can take away from you." Charlotte appreciated the sentiment, But she also recognized that moral victories would provide little comfort if she was ultimately denied the opportunity to serve in her chosen capacity. She had endured months of scrutiny, overcome numerous attempts at sabotage, and demonstrated tactical competence that impressed even her harshest critics. If that wasn't enough, she wondered what would be. Colonel Hayes was already at his desk when Charlotte knocked on his office door, surrounded by file folders and evaluation reports that represented months of intensive assessment. His expression was unreadable as he gestured for her to take a seat across from his desk, but Charlotte noticed that Captain Webb was notably absent from what she had expected to be a larger meeting. "Wilson, your performance during pre-assessment training has been remarkable," Hayes began, his choice of words carrying weight that Charlotte tried not to overanalyze. "Your marksmanship scores are the highest we've recorded in 5 years. Your tactical judgment has been consistently sound. Your physical fitness exceeds our standards by significant margins." Charlotte maintained her composure despite the building anticipation, recognizing that positive feedback was often followed by justifications for negative decisions. She had learned to prepare herself for disappointment while hoping for the best possible outcome. "However," Hayes continued, "your presence has created challenges that extend beyond individual performance metrics. The training environment has been complicated by factors that have nothing to do with your personal capabilities." The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about the political calculations that might override objective performance measures. She thought about the equipment sabotage, the hostile comments from other candidates, the biased evaluations from Captain Webb. If institutional dysfunction was being used to justify her exclusion, then excellence truly didn't matter in the face of systematic resistance. But Hayes wasn't finished. He opened a file folder and extracted a document that Charlotte didn't immediately recognize. "3 days ago, I received a formal complaint from Staff Sergeant Cross regarding the conduct of Captain Webb during your training cycle. According to Cross, Webb deliberately created hostile conditions designed to force your withdrawal rather than objectively assessing your qualifications." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she processed this unexpected development. Cross, who had been one of her most vocal critics early in the training process, had apparently filed a complaint on her behalf. The implications were staggering. If a respected Special Forces veteran was willing to challenge institutional bias, it suggested that her performance had changed minds at levels she hadn't realized. Cross wasn't alone, Hayes continued, extracting additional documents from the file. Morrison, Peterson, and 4 other candidates submitted statements describing specific instances where Webb's evaluations appeared to be influenced by factors other than your tactical performance. More significantly, Master Sergeant Torres, our senior instructor, provided a detailed assessment that contradicts Webb's written evaluations in almost every category. The revelation that multiple soldiers had come forward to support her case filled Charlotte with a complex mixture of gratitude and vindication. These were men who had initially viewed her presence with skepticism, who had questioned whether women belonged in special forces roles. Their willingness to challenge institutional bias on her behalf represented a transformation that extended far beyond individual opinion changes. "Colonel, I never asked anyone to file complaints on my behalf," Charlotte said, wanting to ensure that her success wasn't attributed to administrative protection rather than merit-based achievement. "I tried to handle the challenges through performance rather than paperwork." Hayes nodded, his expression suggesting approval of her approach. That's exactly what these soldiers emphasized in their statements. They described someone who consistently focused on mission accomplishment, despite facing obstacles that other candidates didn't encounter. Cross specifically mentioned your performance during the pilot extraction exercise as the moment he realized that his assumptions about women in combat roles were fundamentally wrong. The weight of institutional recognition began to settle over Charlotte as she understood that her case was being evaluated by people who had overcome their own biases to reach objective conclusions about her capabilities. She thought about Cross's transformation from skeptic to supporter, about Morrison's evolving respect for her tactical skills, about the gradual shift in how she was perceived by the broader candidate group. Based on these statements and my own observations, I've made the decision to remove Captain Webb from this training cycle and to reevaluate all assessments conducted under his supervision, Hayes announced. More importantly, I'm recommending you for immediate advancement to the Special Forces Assessment and Selection course, with full expectation that you will successfully complete the program. The words hit Charlotte with an emotional impact that she struggled to process. After months of uncertainty and institutional resistance, she was being offered the opportunity she had worked toward her entire military career. But even as relief flooded through her system, she recognized the broader significance of the moment. "Sir, what does this mean for other women who might want to pursue Special Forces service?" she asked, thinking about the female soldiers who would follow in her path. Hayes smiled for the first time since the meeting began, his expression suggesting genuine pleasure at the question. "Wilson, your success has already changed how we think about integration policies and assessment protocols. The lessons learned from your training cycle are being incorporated into new guidance that will ensure future female candidates receive fair evaluation based on merit rather than politics." The implications were enormous. Charlotte had not only earned her own opportunity, but had also established precedents and procedures that would benefit other women seeking to serve in Special Forces roles. Her willingness to endure institutional resistance without compromising her principles had created systemic changes that might otherwise have taken decades to implement. But the most significant revelation was yet to come. Hayes opened a final folder and extracted a set of orders that bore official seals and classifications that Charlotte recognized as highly sensitive. "Wilson, your first assignment won't be to a regular Special Forces unit. Based on your demonstrated capabilities and the unique circumstances of your situation, you're being assigned to a joint task force operation that will utilize your specific skills in ways that conventional assignments might not." Charlotte leaned forward as Hayes continued his explanation, understanding that she was being offered not just acceptance but genuine opportunity to contribute her talents at the highest levels of military operations. The assignment would involve working with elite units from multiple branches of service, conducting operations that required the kind of precision, marksmanship, and tactical thinking that had distinguished her throughout training. "The operation is classified, but I can tell you that it involves counter-terrorism activities in a region where your particular combination of skills could be decisive in mission success," Hayes explained. "You'll be working alongside operators from Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and other special operations units who have specifically requested your participation based on reports of your training performance." The magnitude of the opportunity was almost overwhelming. Charlotte had hoped for acceptance into Special Forces service, but she was being offered integration at the elite levels of military operations, where her presence would be valued for her capabilities rather than tolerated as a political necessity. She thought about her father's teachings about earning respect through excellence, about Maria's sacrifice in Afghanistan, about all the women who had dreamed of serving their country without artificial limitations. "There's one more thing, Hayes," sighed, his tone shifting to something more personal than official. "Your performance during this training cycle has impressed people at levels far above my pay grade. There are senior leaders throughout the special operations community who view your success as evidence that integration policies should be expanded and accelerated." Charlotte understood the implications immediately. Her individual success was being interpreted as proof that women could excel in special operations roles, which would likely lead to policy changes that opened more opportunities for female soldiers. The responsibility was enormous. But so was the potential impact on future generations of women in military service. As the meeting concluded, Hayes stood and extended his hand in a gesture that felt more like welcome than mere congratulation. "Wilson, I won't pretend that your path has been easy, or that future assignments won't present similar challenges. But you've proven that excellence transcends politics, that performance speaks louder than prejudice." Charlotte walked out of the headquarters building into a Carolina morning that seemed brighter than any she could remember. Elena was waiting by the parking lot, her expression anxious as she searched Charlotte's face for clues about the meetings. "Outcome, so?" Elena asked, barely able to contain her anticipation. Charlotte allowed herself a smile that felt like the first genuine expression of joy she had experienced in months. "Elena, we did it. We actually did it." The celebration was brief but heartfelt, both women understanding the significance of the moment while recognizing that Charlotte's journey was just beginning. Success in training was only the foundation for operational service that would present new challenges and opportunities to prove herself under real-world conditions. Over the following days, Charlotte began to understand the broader impact of her selection for Special Forces service. Media coverage focused not just on her individual achievement, but on the implications for military policy and women's roles in combat operations. She received calls from female soldiers throughout the Army, many expressing gratitude for breaking barriers that had seemed insurmountable just months earlier. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. Cross approached her during her final week at Fort Bragg, his expression carrying a mixture of respect and what might have been embarrassment about his initial resistance to her presence. "Charlotte, I owe you more than an apology," Cross said, using her first name for the first time since they had met. "I owe you an acknowledgement that I was wrong about everything about your capabilities, about the effects of integration on unit cohesion, about whether women belong in special operations roles." The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful of Charlotte's military career, as Cross explained how watching her performance had forced him to examine his own assumptions and biases. He described the gradual realization that his resistance had been based on cultural conditioning rather than objective assessment of capabilities. "What convinced me wasn't just your shooting, though that was incredible," Cross continued. "It was watching how you handled pressure, how you maintained focus on mission accomplishment even when people were actively working against you. That's exactly the kind of mental toughness we need in special operations." Morrison joined their conversation, along with several other candidates who had initially viewed Charlotte's presence with skepticism. The group dynamic had transformed completely, with her former critics now expressing genuine respect for her achievements and supporting her advancement to operational assignments. "Charlotte, when you get to your first deployment, your teammates are going to be lucky to have you," Morrison said. "You've proven that diversity makes us stronger, that different perspectives and capabilities enhance rather than compromise operational effectiveness." The recognition from her former critics was perhaps more meaningful than official acknowledgments, representing genuine changes in attitudes and assumptions that would influence how future female candidates were received and evaluated. Charlotte had not just earned her own acceptance, but had also changed minds that might otherwise have remained closed to the possibilities of integration. As her time at Fort Bragg drew to a close, Charlotte reflected on the complex journey that had brought her to this point. She had faced institutional resistance, personal attacks, and systematic attempts to undermine her success. But she had also experienced the support of people who overcame their own biases to recognize her capabilities, the gradual transformation of skeptics into allies, and the satisfaction of achieving excellence despite extraordinary obstacles. Master Sergeant Torres, the senior instructor whose assessment had contradicted Captain Webb's biased evaluations, approached Charlotte during her final training exercise with words that would stay with her throughout her operational career. "Wilson, I've been training Special Forces candidates for 23 years. And I've never seen anyone handle adversity the way you have, Torres said. You've shown that character matters more than background, that determination can overcome any obstacle, and that excellence is the ultimate answer to prejudice. The words carried special weight coming from Torres, whose reputation for fairness and competence was legendary throughout the Special Forces community. His endorsement would follow Charlotte to her operational assignment, providing credibility that would ease her integration into units that might otherwise have been skeptical of her presence. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her success was the knowledge that she had maintained her integrity throughout the process. She had refused to compromise her principles, had declined opportunities to take shortcuts or seek administrative protection, and had consistently focused on mission accomplishment rather than personal advancement. As Charlotte prepared for her next assignment, she carried with her the understanding that her journey was far from over. Operational service would present new challenges, require different skills, and test her capabilities in ways that training could only approximate. But she also carried the confidence that came from proving herself under the most demanding circumstances, and the knowledge that she had already changed minds and opened doors that would benefit other women for generations to come. 6 months after Charlotte's deployment to the classified Joint Task Force operation, the Army released a comprehensive study on gender integration in special operations that would reshape military policy for decades to come. The report, officially titled Assessment of Female Integration in Special Operations Forces, was based largely on data collected during Charlotte's training and early operational service, though her name appeared nowhere in the declassified portions due to security classifications surrounding her missions. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, the study's primary author, had followed Charlotte's progress from Fort Bragg through her first combat deployments, documenting performance metrics, unit cohesion measures, and operational effectiveness indicators that told a story of success that exceeded even optimistic projections. Martinez's own career had been shaped by barriers that Charlotte was now dismantling, making her analysis both professionally rigorous and personally meaningful. The data is unambiguous, Martinez explained to a congressional subcommittee tasked with reviewing integration policies. Female personnel who meet special operations standards perform at levels indistinguishable from their male counterparts across all measurable categories. More significantly, integrated units demonstrate enhanced problem-solving capabilities and tactical flexibility that translate directly into mission success rates. The study's findings were supported by testimony from operational commanders who had initially expressed skepticism about integration, but had been converted by observing Charlotte's performance in real-world scenarios. Colonel James Patterson, commander of the Joint Task Force where Charlotte had been assigned, provided particularly compelling evidence of her tactical value during classified operations. Without violating operational security, I can state that this soldier's precision marksmanship has directly contributed to mission success in ways that saved lives and achieved strategic objectives. Patterson testified via secure video link from an undisclosed location. Her presence enhanced rather than compromised our operational capabilities. Elena, who had been promoted to Sergeant First Class and assigned to the Pentagon as a military advisor on integration policies, watched the congressional hearing from the gallery with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. She had seen Charlotte transform from an exceptional soldier fighting institutional resistance into a proven operator, whose success was reshaping military culture at the highest levels. But the most significant testament to Charlotte's impact came from unexpected sources. Staff Sergeant Cross, now serving his second deployment with an integrated Special Forces unit, had become one of the most vocal advocates for expanding opportunities for women in special operations roles. His transformation from skeptic to supporter had made him a powerful voice for change within the traditionally conservative Special Forces community. "I was wrong," Cross stated in the video message recorded during a brief leave from his current Assignment. I let cultural assumptions override objective assessment, and I nearly missed the opportunity to serve alongside one of the finest soldiers I've ever known. Integration works because excellence is excellence, regardless of gender. Meanwhile, Charlotte herself remained largely unaware of the broader implications of her service, focused instead on the immediate demands of operational deployments that tested her skills in ways that no training program could simulate. Her classified work involved precision operations in denied areas, where her unique combination of marksmanship skills and tactical judgment made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The Barrett M82A1, that had first announced her capabilities at Fort Bragg, had been replaced by more advanced weapon systems suited to her specialized role. But Charlotte allowed herself a smile that felt like the first genuine expression of joy she had experienced in months. "Elena, we did it. We actually did it." The celebration was brief but heartfelt, both women understanding the significance of the moment while recognizing that Charlotte's journey was just beginning. Success in training was only the foundation for operational service that would present new challenges and opportunities to prove herself under real-world conditions. Over the following days, Charlotte began to understand the broader impact of her selection for Special Forces service. Media coverage focused not just on her individual achievement, but on the implications for military policy and women's roles in combat operations. She received calls from female soldiers throughout the Army, many expressing gratitude for breaking barriers that had seemed insurmountable just months earlier. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. Cross approached her during her final week at Fort Bragg, his expression carrying a mixture of respect and what might have been embarrassment about his initial resistance to her presence. "Charlotte, I owe you more than an apology," Cross said, using her first name for the first time since they had met. "I owe you an acknowledgement that I was wrong about everything, about your capabilities, about the effects of integration on unit cohesion, about whether women belong in special operations roles." The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful of Charlotte's military career, as Cross explained how watching her performance had forced him to examine his own assumptions and biases. He described the gradual realization that his resistance had been based on cultural conditioning, rather than objective assessment of capabilities. "What convinced me wasn't just your shooting, though that was incredible," Cross continued. "It was watching how you handled pressure, how you maintained focus on mission accomplishment, even when people were actively working against you. That's exactly the kind of mental toughness we need in special operations." Morrison joined their conversation, along with several other candidates who had initially viewed Charlotte's presence with skepticism. The group dynamic had transformed completely, with her former critics now expressing genuine respect for her achievements and supporting her advancement to operational assignments. "Charlotte, when you get to your first deployment, your teammates are going to be lucky to have you," Morrison said. "You've proven that diversity makes us stronger, that different perspectives and capabilities enhance rather than compromise operational effectiveness." The recognition from her former critics was perhaps more meaningful than official acknowledgments, representing genuine changes in attitudes and assumptions that would influence how future female candidates were received and evaluated. Charlotte had not just earned her own acceptance, but had also changed minds that might otherwise have remained closed to the possibilities of integration. As her time at Fort Bragg drew to a close, Charlotte reflected on the complex journey that had brought her to this point. She had faced institutional resistance, personal attacks, and systematic attempts to undermine her success. But she had also experienced the support of people who overcame their own biases to recognize her capabilities, the gradual transformation of skeptics into allies, and the satisfaction of achieving excellence despite extraordinary obstacles. Master Sergeant Torres, the senior instructor whose assessment had contradicted Captain Webb's biased evaluations, approached Charlotte during her final training exercise with words that would stay with her throughout her operational career. "Wilson, I've been training Special Forces candidates for 23 years, and I've never seen anyone handle adversity the way you have," Torres said. "You've shown that character matters more than background, that determination can overcome any obstacle, and that excellence is the ultimate answer to prejudice." The words carried special weight coming from Torres, whose reputation for fairness and competence was legendary throughout the Special Forces community. His endorsement would follow Charlotte to her operational assignment, providing credibility that would ease her integration into units that might otherwise have been skeptical of her presence. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her success was the knowledge that she had maintained her integrity throughout the process. She had refused to compromise her principles, had declined opportunities to take shortcuts or seek administrative protection, and had consistently focused on mission accomplishment rather than personal advancement. As Charlotte prepared for her next assignment, she carried with her the understanding that her journey was far from over. Operational service would present new challenges, require different skills, and test her capabilities in ways that training could only approximate. But she also carried the confidence that came from proving herself under the most demanding circumstances, and the knowledge that she had already changed minds and opened doors that would benefit other women for generations to come. 6 months after Charlotte's deployment to the classified Joint Task Force operation, the Army released a comprehensive study on gender integration in special operations that would reshape military policy for decades to come. The report, officially titled Assessment of Female Integration in Special Operations Forces, was based largely on data collected during Charlotte's training and early operational service, though her name appeared nowhere in the declassified portions due to security classification surrounding her missions. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, the study's primary author, had followed Charlotte's progress from Fort Bragg through her first combat deployments, documenting performance metrics, unit cohesion measures, and operational effectiveness indicators that told a story of success that exceeded even optimistic projections. Martinez's own career had been shaped by barriers that Charlotte was now dismantling, making her analysis both professionally rigorous and personally meaningful. "The data is unambiguous," Martinez explained to a congressional subcommittee tasked with reviewing integration policies. "Female personnel who meet special operations standards perform at levels indistinguishable from their male counterparts across all measurable categories. More significantly, integrated units demonstrate enhanced problem-solving capabilities and tactical flexibility that translate directly into mission success rates." The study's findings were supported by testimony from operational commanders who had initially expressed skepticism about integration but had been converted by observing Charlotte's performance in real-world scenarios. Colonel James Patterson, commander of the Joint Task Force where Charlotte had been assigned, provided particularly compelling evidence of her tactical value during classified operations. "Without violating operational security, I can state that this soldier's precision marksmanship has directly contributed to mission success in ways that saved lives and achieved strategic objectives," Patterson testified via secure video link from an undisclosed location. "Her presence enhanced rather than compromised our operational capabilities." Elena, who had been promoted to Sergeant First Class and assigned to the Pentagon as a military advisor on integration policies, watched the congressional hearing from the gallery with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. She had seen Charlotte transform from an exceptional soldier fighting institutional resistance into a proven operator, whose success was reshaping military culture at the highest levels. But the most significant testament to Charlotte's impact came from unexpected sources. Staff Sergeant Cross, now serving his second deployment with an integrated Special Forces unit, had become one of the most vocal advocates for expanding opportunities for women in special operations roles. His transformation from skeptic to supporter had made him a powerful voice for change within the traditionally conservative Special Forces community. "I was wrong," Cross stated in a video message recorded during a brief leave from his current assignment. "I let cultural assumptions override objective assessment, and I nearly missed the opportunity to serve alongside one of the finest soldiers I've ever known." Integration works because excellence is excellence, regardless of gender. Meanwhile, Charlotte herself remained largely unaware of the broader implications of her service, focused instead on the immediate demands of operational deployments that tested her skills in ways that no training program could simulate. Her classified work involved precision operations in denied areas, where her unique combination of marksmanship skills and tactical judgment made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The Barrett M82A1 that had first announced her capabilities at Fort Bragg had been replaced by more advanced weapon systems suited to her specialized role, but Charlotte's fundamental approach remained unchanged. She studied each mission with obsessive attention to detail, prepared for every contingency, and executed assigned tasks with the precision that had become her trademark. Captain Lisa Chun, a helicopter pilot who had worked with Charlotte on multiple operations, observed the evolution of attitudes toward female special operations personnel from a unique perspective. Chun had been one of the first women to fly combat missions in Afghanistan, and she recognized the parallels between her own experiences and Charlotte's journey. "When I first started flying combat missions, every mistake was magnified, every success was minimized," Chun reflected during an interview for a documentary about women in combat roles. "But I've watched the culture change, watched male soldiers learn that competence matters more than gender." Charlotte's success has accelerated that transformation in ways that might have taken decades without her example. The documentary, produced by an independent filmmaker with extensive military experience, had been granted unprecedented access to interview soldiers who had served with Charlotte during various phases of her career. The resulting portrait showed not just individual achievement, but systemic change that was reverberating throughout the military hierarchy. Master Sergeant David Kim, Charlotte's team leader during a particularly challenging operation, provided insight into how her presence had affected unit dynamics in ways that surprised even experienced special operations leaders. "Initially, we were concerned about integration because special ops units function like families, and we worried about disrupting relationships that took years to develop," Kim explained. "But Charlotte integrated so seamlessly that within weeks, we couldn't imagine the team without her. She brought capabilities we didn't have and perspectives that made us more effective." Back in North Carolina, Charlotte's mother Sarah had become an inadvertent spokesperson for military families dealing with the unique pressures of having daughters in combat roles. She received regular calls from other mothers whose daughters were pursuing military careers, seeking advice about supporting children who were breaking gender barriers in traditionally male-dominated fields. "I won't pretend it isn't terrifying," Sarah Wilson admitted during a town hall meeting organized by the local veterans organization. "Every mother worries about their child in military service, but there's an additional burden when your daughter is the first to do something, when she's carrying expectations that go beyond her individual service." But Sarah's concerns were balanced by immense pride in Charlotte's achievements and their broader implications for other young women. She had established a scholarship fund for female students pursuing ROTC commissions, using donations that poured in from supporters who viewed Charlotte's success as inspiration for their own daughters. The scholarship recipients represented diverse backgrounds and career aspirations, but they shared a common understanding that Charlotte's journey had created opportunities that previous generations of women could only dream about. Lieutenant Patricia Morales, one of the first recipients, was currently training for Special Forces selection herself, following directly in Charlotte's path. Charlotte Wilson proved that the barriers were artificial, that women could excel at the highest levels of military service if given fair opportunities. Morales explained during her own pre-assessment training at Fort Bragg. She didn't just break through the ceiling. She demolished it so thoroughly that the rest of us can walk through. The institutional changes prompted by Charlotte's success extended far beyond special operations. The Army had revised physical fitness standards, updated training protocols, and modified equipment specifications to better accommodate female personnel across all combat specialties. These changes were based on objective performance data rather than assumptions about gender-based limitations. Colonel Hayes, who had been promoted to brigadier general and assigned to lead the Army's special operations integration efforts, frequently spoke about the lessons learned from Charlotte's training cycle. His presentations to senior military leaders emphasized the importance of merit-based assessment and the dangers of allowing cultural biases to influence operational decisions. Wilson's success taught us that our assumptions about integration were based on fears rather than facts, Hayes explained during a joint services conference on military personnel policies. When we focused on capabilities rather than categories, we discovered talent that we had been systematically overlooking. The international implications of Charlotte's achievement were also significant. Allied militaries that had been watching American integration efforts closely began accelerating their own programs, citing the success demonstrated by soldiers like Charlotte as evidence that gender integration enhanced rather than compromised military effectiveness. Captain Rebecca Thompson, a British Army officer attending the U.S. Army War College, wrote her graduate thesis on the strategic implications of gender integration in special operations forces. Her research, which included extensive analysis of Charlotte's operational record, concluded that integrated units demonstrated superior performance across multiple metrics compared to traditional all-male teams. The American experience, exemplified by soldiers like Charlotte Wilson, proves that diversity is a force multiplier rather than a liability, Thompson wrote. Militaries that embrace integration will gain significant advantages over those that cling to traditional limitations. As Charlotte's operational tour continued, she remained focused on mission accomplishment rather than her role as a symbol of progress. But she was increasingly aware of the responsibility that came with her pioneering status, particularly when interacting with young female soldiers who viewed her as proof that their own aspirations were achievable. During a brief leave period, Charlotte visited her old unit at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where she had served before pursuing Special Forces training. The reception from her former colleagues was uniformly positive, but she was particularly struck by conversations with junior enlisted women who peppered her with questions about career paths and opportunities. "Ma'am, how do you handle the pressure of representing all women in the military?" asked Private First Class Jennifer Martinez, a combat medic who was considering applying for special operations training herself. Charlotte's response reflected the wisdom gained through months of navigating institutional resistance and personal attacks. "You don't represent all women any more than male soldiers represent all men. You represent yourself, your training, and your commitment to excellence. Focus on being the best soldier you can be, and let your performance speak for itself." The advice resonated with Martinez and the other young soldiers present, many of whom had grown up during Charlotte's rise to prominence and viewed integrated combat roles as normal rather than exceptional. For them, Charlotte's success represented not a breakthrough but a confirmation of possibilities they had always assumed were available. This generational shift was perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Charlotte's achievement. Young women entering military service no longer viewed special operations roles as impossible dreams, but as legitimate career objectives that required dedication and excellence, but were fundamentally achievable. The psychological barriers that had limited previous generations had been systematically dismantled. Elena, now serving as a senior advisor on integration policies, regularly briefed senior military leaders on the cultural changes that had followed Charlotte's success. Her presentations included data showing dramatic increases in the number of women pursuing combat specialties, improvements in retention rates among female soldiers, and enhanced unit cohesion in integrated formations. Charlotte's success created a cascade effect that continues to transform military culture. Elena explained during a briefing to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Her achievement proved that excellence transcends gender, and that message has resonated throughout the force structure. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition of Charlotte's impact came from an unexpected source. The special operations community, traditionally resistant to external recognition and publicity, established an annual award honoring soldiers who demonstrated exceptional courage in breaking barriers while maintaining operational excellence. The Charlotte Wilson Award would be presented to personnel who overcame institutional obstacles to achieve distinction in previously restricted roles. The award's establishment reflected the community's acknowledgement that Charlotte's journey had strengthened rather than weakened special operations capabilities. By proving that talent could be found in previously overlooked populations, she had helped identify and develop human resources that enhanced military effectiveness across all domains. As Charlotte prepared for her next assignment, a leadership role that would involve training the next generation of special operations personnel, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had achieved her personal goal of serving in special forces, but more importantly, she had created opportunities for countless other women to pursue their own military aspirations without artificial limitations. The institutional changes were irreversible. Military culture had been fundamentally altered by her success, and future generations of female soldiers would benefit from policies and procedures that emphasized merit over assumptions. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had been reduced to historical footnotes, remembered primarily as examples of how quickly institutions could change when confronted with undeniable evidence of their own limitations. Charlotte's mother, Sarah, now recognized as one of the most influential military family advocates in North Carolina, often spoke about the broader implications of her daughter's achievement. During interviews and public appearances, she emphasized that Charlotte's success represented not just individual accomplishment, but systemic progress that would benefit society as a whole. "My daughter proved that when we remove artificial barriers, we discover capabilities we never knew existed," Sarah explained during a graduation ceremony at the local high school. That lesson applies far beyond the military. It applies to every institution that has limited people based on assumptions rather than assessment. The ripple effects continued to expand as Charlotte's story inspired women in civilian careers, business leadership, and other traditionally male-dominated fields. Her example of perseverance, excellence, and integrity under pressure provided a template for overcoming institutional resistance in any context where barriers existed based on category rather than capability. As Charlotte looked toward her future assignments and continued service, she carried with her the knowledge that her individual journey had created lasting change that would benefit generations of women seeking to serve their country at the highest levels. The weight of that legacy was enormous, but so was the satisfaction of knowing that her commitment to excellence had opened doors that would never be closed again. 3 years later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Special Operations Training Compound as Charlotte Wilson, now Captain Wilson, watched a new class of candidates prepare for their first marksmanship evaluation. Among the 37 hopefuls gathered on the range, 11 were women, a number that would have been unimaginable just 5 years earlier. She stood beside the Barrett M82A1 that had become legendary within Special Forces circles, though none of the candidates yet understood its significance in their own presence here. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of Charlotte's former scholarship recipients, and now a qualified Special Forces officer herself, approached the observation tower where Charlotte was conducting evaluations. Chen's own journey had been remarkably similar to Charlotte's. but without the institutional resistance that had marked those early pioneering efforts. The pathway that Charlotte had carved through military bureaucracy had become a well-established route that dozens of women had followed successfully. "Ma'am, the candidates are ready for the precision shooting assessment," Shun reported, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to be there. "Should we proceed with the standard protocol?" Charlotte smiled at the question, remembering her own first day on this same range when the standard protocol had been designed more to eliminate her than evaluate her fairly. Now the assessment was truly merit-based, focusing on the marksmanship skills and tactical judgment that were essential for special operations success. "Let's give them the full course, Lieutenant," Charlotte replied, watching as the candidates took their positions behind various weapon systems. Same standards that have always mattered: precision, consistency, and performance under pressure. Among the candidates preparing their equipment, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos caught Charlotte's attention. Santos was a former Army Ranger seeking to transition into Special Forces, and her background included 2 combat deployments where she had distinguished herself as a designated marksman. Her presence represented the kind of natural career progression that had once been impossible for women but was now routine. As the shooting commenced, Charlotte observed not just individual performance, but the group dynamics that had evolved. Since integration became normalized, male and female candidates worked together naturally, sharing equipment knowledge and providing mutual support without the artificial tensions that had characterized her own training cycle. The culture had fundamentally shifted from viewing integration as an experiment to accepting it as standard operating procedure. Private First Class Jennifer Martinez, whom Charlotte had met during her visit to Fort Campbell 2 years earlier, was among the candidates attempting the challenging precision shots that had first announced Charlotte's capabilities. Martinez's form was textbook perfect, her breathing controlled, and her confidence evident in every movement. When her shot struck the target dead center at 400 meters, several male candidates nodded their approval without surprise. Competence was expected regardless of who demonstrated it. "Outstanding shooting, Martinez," called out Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior instructor who had replaced the problematic Captain Webb. Rodriguez's evaluations were known for their fairness and accuracy, focusing exclusively on performance metrics rather than politics or personal biases. "Your fundamentals are solid, and your follow-through is excellent." Charlotte felt a deep satisfaction watching the seamless integration of these new candidates into training that had once been designed to exclude people like them. The barriers that had seemed insurmountable during her own journey had been so thoroughly dismantled that current candidates could focus entirely on meeting standards rather than fighting for the opportunity to attempt them. Elena, now Major Rodriguez and serving as the Deputy Commander for Special Operations Training, joined Charlotte in the observation tower to review the day's results. Her promotion had come through the same merit-based system that was now standard throughout special operations, and her expertise in integration policies had made her one of the most sought-after advisors in the military. "The scores from this class are remarkable," Elena observed, reviewing the data on her tablet. "Average marksmanship performance is actually higher than we saw in traditional all-male classes, and the candidates are demonstrating superior teamwork and problem-solving abilities." The statistics confirmed what Charlotte had suspected from her observations, that diversity actually enhanced rather than compromised military effectiveness. Units that included personnel with different backgrounds, perspectives, and capabilities consistently outperformed homogeneous groups across multiple measures of success. "It makes sense when you think about it," Charlotte replied, watching as the candidates moved to their next evaluation station. "When you're truly selecting for excellence rather than conformity, you're going to get better results." 5 years later, the Pentagon briefing room was packed beyond capacity as Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams prepared to announce the most significant military personnel policy change in decades. Charlotte, now Major Wilson and serving as a senior advisor on Special Operations Integration, sat in the front row alongside other officers whose careers had been shaped by the transformation of military culture. Based on comprehensive analysis of operational performance data collected over the past 8 years, Secretary Williams announced, "The Department of Defense is formally removing all remaining gender restrictions from military occupational specialties and leadership positions. Effective immediately, all roles will be open to qualified personnel regardless of gender." The announcement represented the culmination of changes that had begun with Charlotte's success at Fort Bragg and had accelerated as evidence accumulated demonstrating the effectiveness of integrated units. What had started as an experiment in gender integration had evolved into a fundamental restructuring of how the military identified, developed, and utilized human resources. General Patricia Hayes, Charlotte's former commander who had been promoted to lead Joint Special Operations Command, provided the operational perspective that supported the policy change. "Our integrated units consistently demonstrate superior performance across all measured categories," Hayes explained to the assembled media and military leaders. "This isn't about social policy, it's about military effectiveness and our obligation to field the best possible force." Charlotte watched the announcement with a mixture of pride and surreal disbelief. The barriers that had once seemed permanent fixtures of military culture had been completely eliminated in less than a decade. Young women entering military service would never face the systematic obstacles that had defined her own journey, would never have to prove their worth against artificially elevated standards designed to ensure their failure. After the ceremony, Charlotte was approached by a cluster of junior officers who had grown up during the integration era and viewed her as a historical figure rather than a contemporary. Their questions reflected genuine curiosity about what military service had been like before integration became routine. "Ma'am, what was it like being the only woman in Special Forces training?" asked Second Lieutenant Ashley Park, a recent West Point graduate who was planning to pursue Ranger School after completing her initial assignment. "I can't imagine having to prove that women belong there instead of just focusing on meeting the standards." Charlotte considered her response carefully, wanting to convey the challenges she had faced without discouraging the next generation from pursuing their own ambitious goals. It was difficult in ways that had nothing to do with the actual requirements of military service, she said finally. But it was also incredibly meaningful, knowing that success would create opportunities for people like you. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Charlotte sharing stories about the equipment sabotage, the biased evaluations, and the gradual transformation of skeptics into supporters. For these young officers, her experiences seemed like ancient history, but they listened with fascination to accounts of institutional barriers that had been completely eliminated from their own military experience. 7 years later, the auditorium at Fort Bragg was filled to capacity for the annual Special Operations Awards ceremony, where the most distinguished members of the community were recognized for exceptional service and achievement. Charlotte, now Lieutenant Colonel Wilson and commanding officer of the Special Operations Training Command, sat on the stage alongside other senior leaders as the evening's events unfolded. The highlight of the ceremony was the presentation of the Charlotte Wilson Award for Excellence in Breaking Barriers, established 3 years earlier to recognize personnel who had overcome institutional obstacles while maintaining exceptional operational performance. This year's recipient was Master Sergeant David Kim, a Korean-American soldier whose innovations in unconventional warfare tactics had revolutionized special operations doctrine. Sergeant Kim's achievement represents exactly the kind of excellence that emerges when we focus on capabilities rather than categories, Charlotte said as she presented the award. His success proves that barriers limit not just individuals, but institutional effectiveness, and that removing those barriers makes us stronger as a military and as a nation. The audience, which included senior military leaders from across the services as well as international allies studying American integration policies, applauded enthusiastically. Charlotte's words carried special weight because of her own journey, but more importantly because of the measurable improvements in military effectiveness that had followed the systematic removal of barriers based on assumptions rather than assessment. After the ceremony, Charlotte was approached by General Maria Santos, the first Hispanic woman to command a Special Forces group and another beneficiary of the opportunities that integration had created. Santos had followed Charlotte's path through special operations training 5 years earlier, but her experience had been marked by acceptance rather than resistance. "Charlotte, I wanted to thank you personally for making it possible for people like me to serve at this level," Santos said, her words carrying genuine emotion. "But more than that, I wanted you to know that your legacy isn't just about breaking barriers, it's about proving that excellence comes in many forms." The recognition from Santos was particularly meaningful because it reflected how Charlotte's individual success had enabled systemic changes that benefited not just women but all previously underrepresented groups seeking to serve in elite military roles. The principles of merit-based assessment and inclusive excellence had applications far beyond gender integration. 10 years later, Charlotte's retirement ceremony took place on the same range where she had first demonstrated her marksmanship skills with the Barrett M82A1 more than a decade earlier. Now Brigadier General Wilson, she was concluding a career that had fundamentally transformed military culture and opened opportunities for countless others to serve their country without artificial limitations. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of soldiers whose careers had been shaped by the changes Charlotte had pioneered. Elena, now a full colonel and commanding the Army's Personnel Integration Office, served as the master of ceremonies for an event that celebrated not just individual achievement but institutional transformation. General Wilson's legacy cannot be measured solely by her own remarkable service record, Elena announced to the assembled crowd. It must be measured by the thousands of soldiers who have followed the path she pioneered, by the barriers she demolished, and by the proof she provided that excellence transcends every category except character. Among the attendees were soldiers from every branch of service and dozens of international allies who had studied American integration policies. Their presence testified to the global impact of Charlotte's success, which had influenced military personnel policies far beyond the United States and had contributed to a fundamental reimagining of how modern militaries could best utilize human resources. Charlotte's farewell address focused not on her own achievements, but on the broader transformation that her journey had helped catalyze. "When I first arrived at Fort Bragg with dreams of serving in Special Forces, I thought success would be measured by my individual performance," she told the audience. "I never imagined that the real victory would be creating a military where young soldiers never have to choose between their identity and their service, where excellence is recognized regardless of its source." The Barrett M82A1, that had announced her capabilities during that first evaluation, was presented to Charlotte as a retirement gift, but she immediately donated it to the Special Operations Museum as a symbol of the transformation that had taken place. Her action emphasized that the real importance of her story lay not in personal glory, but in the institutional changes that would benefit future generations of military personnel. 15 years later, the Charlotte Wilson Leadership Institute, established at Fort Bragg 5 years after her retirement, had become the premier center for research on military integration and inclusive leadership. The Institute's work influenced personnel policies throughout the Department of Defense and provided consultation to allied militaries seeking to optimize their own human resource utilization. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had left active duty to serve as the Institute's director, regularly hosted conferences that brought together military leaders, academic researchers, and policy experts to share lessons learned from the integration era. The discussions always returned to the fundamental principles that Charlotte's success had demonstrated, that institutional excellence required inclusive opportunity and merit-based assessment. The Wilson case study remains the definitive example of how individual courage can catalyze systemic change. Dr. Rodriguez explained during a presentation to NATO military leaders. But more importantly, it demonstrates that barriers based on assumptions rather than evidence limit institutional effectiveness in ways that compromise mission accomplishment. The Institute's research had documented measurable improvements in military effectiveness following integration policies, providing empirical evidence that diversity enhanced rather than compromised operational capabilities. These findings had influenced personnel policies throughout the alliance and had contributed to similar transformations in civilian organizations seeking to optimize human resource utilization. Charlotte herself remained involved with the Institute as a senior advisor, though she preferred to focus on mentoring young leaders rather than relitigating battles that had been decisively won years earlier. Her conversations with emerging military officers emphasized the continuing importance of excellence and integrity, while acknowledging that the barriers she had faced no longer existed. During a recent visit to the Institute, Charlotte was approached by Captain Jennifer Martinez, the former private first class who had once asked her about handling the pressure of representation. Martinez was now a company commander in the 75th Ranger Regiment and was being considered for special operations assignment herself. "General Wilson, I wanted you to know that my daughter starts at West Point next month," Martinez said, her voice carrying obvious pride. "When I told her about your story, she asked me why anyone would have thought women couldn't be soldiers. I realized that's the greatest measure of your success, that the barriers you faced seem incomprehensible to her." Generation. The observation captured the essence of Charlotte's legacy. By systematically dismantling institutional barriers through exceptional performance and unwavering integrity, she had created a military environment where artificial limitations seemed not just wrong but absurd. Future generations of soldiers would serve in a truly merit-based system where opportunity was limited only by individual capability and commitment. 20 years later, the documentary Barriers Broken, the Charlotte Wilson story, premiered at the Pentagon to an audience that included current and former military leaders from around the world. The film, produced by an independent filmmaker with extensive military experience, told the story of integration through interviews with soldiers who had witnessed the transformation firsthand. Charlotte, now in her late 50s and serving as a consultant on military leadership development, watched the documentary with a mixture of pride and amazement at how completely military culture had changed. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable were now historical curiosities, remembered primarily as examples of how quickly institutions could evolve when confronted with undeniable evidence of their limitations. The film's most powerful moments came from interviews with soldiers who had served during the transition period, describing how Charlotte's success had changed their own assumptions and biases. Staff Sergeant Cross, now a retired Command Sergeant Major, provided particularly compelling testimony about his personal transformation from skeptic to advocate. "I was completely wrong about everything," Cross acknowledged in his interview. "I let cultural assumptions override objective assessment, and I nearly missed the opportunity to serve alongside one of the finest soldiers I've ever known." Charlotte's success taught me that excellence transcends every category except character. The documentary's conclusion focused on the measurable improvements in military effectiveness that had followed integration policies, providing empirical evidence that Charlotte's success had enhanced rather than compromised institutional capabilities. Units that included diverse personnel consistently outperformed homogeneous groups across multiple measures of operational success. After the screening, Charlotte participated in a panel discussion that included Elena, General Santos, and other officers whose careers had been shaped by the integration era. The conversation focused not on past struggles, but on continuing opportunities to optimize human resource utilization and maintain the inclusive excellence that had become the military's defining characteristic. The lesson from this period isn't just about gender integration, Charlotte emphasized during her remarks. It's about the importance of basing institutional policies on evidence rather than assumptions, of recognizing that barriers limit not just individuals but organizational effectiveness. The panel discussion was attended by young officers who represented the culmination of the changes Charlotte had pioneered. For them, integrated service was not a breakthrough but a baseline expectation, and their questions reflected concern for continuing to optimize military effectiveness rather than fighting battles that had been decisively won decades earlier. 25 years later, Charlotte's granddaughter Sarah, named for the woman who had supported Charlotte's military journey from the beginning, graduated first in her class from West Point and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry. Her achievement would have been impossible during Charlotte's era but was now routine, representing the complete normalization of opportunities that had once been revolutionary. The graduation ceremony was attended by 4 generations of the Wilson family, including Charlotte's mother Sarah, now in her 80s but still proudly supporting military families through her advocacy work. The presence of multiple generations of women who had served or supported military service testified to the lasting impact of Charlotte's pioneering efforts. During her graduation speech, young Sarah Wilson acknowledged her grandmother's legacy, while emphasizing that current and future military challenges required continued innovation and excellence. "My grandmother proved that barriers exist only until someone has the courage to break them," Sarah said to her fellow graduates. "Our obligation is to continue that tradition of excellence while ensuring that opportunity remains open to anyone willing to earn it." Charlotte watched her granddaughter's commissioning with profound satisfaction, knowing that the young woman would serve in a military that judged personnel based on capability rather than category. The systematic barriers that had once defined Charlotte's experience had been so thoroughly eliminated that they seemed like artifacts from a different era. The ceremony concluded with the traditional hat toss, as newly commissioned officers celebrated the beginning of careers that would be limited only by their own ambitions and abilities. Charlotte had helped create a military where excellence was the only criterion that mattered, where opportunity was determined by merit rather than assumptions about limitations. 30 years later, the final entry in Charlotte's private journal, written on the 30th anniversary of her first day at Special Forces training, captured the magnitude of the transformation that her journey had helped catalyze. "Today I visited Fort Bragg and watched young soldiers train for special operations service without giving a second thought to barriers that once seemed insurmountable. The range where I first proved myself with the Barrett M82A1 is now used by men and women, training together as natural teammates, focused on excellence rather than fighting for the right to pursue it. The military I helped create is stronger, more effective, and more just than the one I entered 40 years ago. Not because we lowered standards, but because we raised them, insisting that opportunity be based on merit rather than assumptions, that excellence be recognized regardless of its source. My individual journey was important, but only as a catalyst for systemic changes that will benefit generations of Americans seeking to serve their country. The real victory wasn't my own success, but the creation of a military where young people never have to choose between their identity and their service, where barriers exist only until someone has the courage to break them. I am proud to have served, proud to have contributed to institutional transformation, and grateful to have lived long enough to see the military become what it was always meant to be, a true meritocracy where excellence is the only measure that matters." Charlotte set down her pen and looked out at the North Carolina mountains, where her father had first taught her to shoot. where she had learned the lessons about excellence and integrity that had sustained her through every challenge. The barriers were gone, the transformation was complete, and future generations would serve in a military, limited only by their willingness to pursue excellence. The Barrett M82A1, that had announced her capabilities decades earlier, was now displayed in the Smithsonian Institution as a symbol of the period when American military culture had been fundamentally transformed by individuals willing to prove that excellence transcended every artificial limitation. Its presence in the nation's museum testified to the historical significance of changes that had once seemed impossible but had become routine through the accumulated force of exceptional performance and unwavering integrity. As Charlotte reflected on her journey from that first challenging day at Fort Bragg to the transformed military culture that now existed, she understood that her individual story had been important primarily as proof of broader principles that would continue to guide American military excellence for generations to come. The silence that had once surrounded opportunities for women in special operations had been broken permanently, replaced by the sound of young soldiers training together in pursuit of shared excellence, focused on mission accomplishment rather than fighting for the right to serve. The barriers were gone, the transformation was complete, and the future belonged to anyone willing to earn it through exceptional performance and unwavering commitment to the principles that had always defined American military service at its finest. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon.